Hello, my name is Sophia. They said my brother tried to hurt her, my stepmother, and my father didn't even ask. He just kicked him out, like throwing out the trash you're ashamed someone might find. But what if the lie wasn't the worst part? What if the worst part was how quiet it all was afterward? How they erased his name from the will, rewrote the story, called her the victim, while I stood in the hallway and said nothing. They wanted me to disappear too. Just a girl, just the youngest, just quiet. But I saw everything, and I kept the proof. So tell me, what would you do if your family asked you to smile through the funeral of your own truth? They say you can feel it when something is about to break. That night, the air inside our Denver home was still, but not peaceful. The kind of stillness before a storm, like the house itself was holding its breath. I remember the way my heels echoed lightly against the wood floor upstairs as I walked toward my bedroom. Kale was downstairs, curled up on the living room sofa with a book in his lap, a glass of water untouched beside him. He looked calm, too calm, like someone unaware that the ground beneath him was already cracking. Outside, through the window, I could see Varela pacing the garden. Her silk robe shimmered faintly under the patio lights. She moved like she was waiting for her cue. I paused at the top of the stairs. Something wasn't right. The weight in my stomach wasn't nerves. It was dread. Then, a scream. Sharp. Violent. It wasn't a normal scream. It sliced through the silence like shattered glass. My legs moved before my brain did. I ran to the stairwell, heart hammering against my ribs. I saw Orwin first. My father, bursting from his study like he'd been shot out of a cannon. His eyes darted wildly until they locked on Varela. She was standing near the base of the stairs, her robe torn slightly at the shoulder. Her eyes, glassy, unfocused, immediately flooded with tears. Her hand trembled as she pointed at Kyle. "He tried to assault me," she choked out. "Your son, he grabbed me. He tried to—" Her voice broke into sobs. Time stopped. Kyle stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs. His mouth hung open, eyes wide. He didn't move, didn't defend himself. He looked like someone whose soul had just been ripped from his chest. Orwin's face hardened. He didn't ask questions. He didn't blink. He just stepped forward and, without a single word, slapped Kyle across the face. The sound rang through the foyer like a gunshot. I gasped. Kyle stumbled back but didn't fall. His eyes found mine. They held me for only a second, but I'll carry that second for the rest of my life. It wasn't a look of anger. It was betrayal, not at Varela, not even at Dad, at me, because I didn't speak. I opened my mouth. "Dad, wait." But one of the house staff stepped in front of me. Her tone was flat, rehearsed. "This doesn't involve you, Sophia. Let your father handle it." Handle it? Kale's suitcase, never even packed, was shoved into his hands. Orwin didn't let him go upstairs. He told him to get out. Just like that. The front door opened. The night outside was black and cold. Rain pelted down like the sky was punishing us all. Kale stepped into it without a word. He was gone in less than 5 minutes, and we never spoke about him again. I watched from my window as he stood in the driveway, drenched, the same spot where we used to race bicycles as kids. He didn't look back. He didn't cry. He just walked into the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run after him. But I didn't. I stood still, paralyzed, powerless. Or maybe I wasn't powerless. Maybe I was just silent. And that silence, I'd later realize, was its own kind of betrayal. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each creak in the floorboards below. My father never came to check on me. Varela never apologized. And I never forgave myself. Kale wasn't perfect. But he wasn't a monster. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike. He held my hand during storms when I was 5 and swore he'd always keep me safe. He was my big brother. And just like that, he was gone. Because of a lie. Because no one asked for the truth. Because we all played our parts too well. The next morning, the house smelled like coffee and betrayal. Varela hummed in the kitchen like she hadn't just ruined a life. Orwin read the paper, his expression unreadable. No one mentioned Kyle, not once. I went to the window again. His footprints had washed away in the rain, like he'd never been there at all. That was the night I lost a brother, and began to lose myself. The front door slammed shut behind him like a coffin lid sealing. But something in me knew. I'd be the one to bury the lie. But something in me knew. I'd be the one to bury the lie. Weeks passed, yet that night refused to loosen its grip. The rain had stopped, but the silence in our home had only thickened. Everything inside the house still looked the same framed photos, same smell of fresh pine cleaner on the floors, but none of it felt familiar anymore. That morning, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as it gurgled. The scent was comforting, but it hit a wall before it reached my chest. Across the room, Virella hummed as she sliced a pear, her smile as practiced as her mascara line. Orwin sat at the breakfast bar, flipping through a local paper without really reading. I opened my mouth. I wanted to ask how Kale was. I wanted to demand why no one had said his name in over 3 weeks, but I already knew the answer. "We don't speak of that anymore," Dad said coldly, before I could utter a syllable. He didn't even look at me when he said it. It was said like a house rule, like someone had died, and maybe, in this house, Kyle had. I excused myself and walked upstairs to get ready for the day. My footsteps sounded hollow against the stairs, echoing like I was walking through someone else's home. Later that afternoon, I passed by the study. The door was almost shut, but not quite. Enough for me to hear voices inside, muffled, clipped, professional. "I think if we move the assets under the charitable trust, there won't be any complications," someone said. "Just make sure it's clean," Varela replied, her tone crisp like she was ordering lunch. Orwin's voice followed, softer. "He signed those documents last year, didn't he?" Silence. I stepped back. My pulse ticked behind my ears. I waited until the hallway was clear before slipping past the staircase and into the sunroom. A few minutes later, the housekeeper came in to dust. "Gretchen?" I asked quietly. "What were they discussing?" She froze. Just for a moment, then lowered her gaze to her rag. "They're reallocating Mr. Kale's shares. You weren't supposed to know." "Without telling him?" She shrugged, then walked away like her spine had melted. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk with a cup of tea growing cold beside me. I opened my laptop, staring at the last email Kale had sent me, 3 months before the incident. A link to a playlist he made, for when your world feels like static. He always knew. 2 days later, I got a text. No sender ID, just a message. "He's in the hospital. Car accident. Not serious." I didn't think. I grabbed my keys, shoved my phone in my pocket, and drove straight to St. Clair Medical. The lobby was quiet, dimly lit, with soft jazz playing in the background like pain had to be soothed with Miles Davis. "I'm here to see Kyle Darlington," I told the nurse at the desk. She typed, then frowned. "I'm sorry, he's not accepting visitors." "I'm his sister," I said quickly. Her eyes flicked back to the screen. "Only immediate family are on the list." "I am immediate family," she sighed. "It says here that only one emergency contact is allowed. That's a Miss Varela Darlington." My throat went dry. Of course she did. "Can you at least tell me if he's okay?" "I'm not authorized to share anything beyond what's listed. I'm sorry." I stepped back, nodded politely, and walked outside into the parking lot. It was near midnight. I climbed into my car and pulled my coat tighter around me, watching the hospital entrance like a soldier on a silent post. Nurses came and went. A security guard chatted with someone in scrubs. I waited. I didn't know for what. A sign. A glimpse. Something. It never came. I stayed until the sky turned lavender with dawn. Then I left. That evening, after a long drive home and a cold shower, I stood in front of the mirror in the downstairs guest bathroom. It was the one closest to the garage, rarely used. It smelled like old soap and citrus cleaner. I stared at my face. I looked unrecognizable. And for the first time, I let the thought settle like dust on my tongue. I don't belong here anymore. It wasn't said aloud. It didn't need to be. I had been erased, not in some dramatic public disowning, but through silence, quiet decisions, convenient exclusions. You think being kicked out is the worst thing that can happen to you? But being forgotten? That's worse, because you're still in the house, still sitting at the table, still hearing your name, until one day you realize no one says it anymore. No one calls for you. No one asks what you think. They say family is where you're always welcome. But what if you've been locked out and didn't even hear the click? The weight of being invisible doesn't come all at once. It trickles in, moment by moment, until you realize you've become a guest in your own life. After that night in the hospital parking lot, I withdrew from everything for a while. Work, social obligations, even the book club I'd clung to for normalcy. I let it all go quiet. It wasn't grief that consumed me. It was absence. A gnawing void, like someone had erased a piece of my name, and I couldn't pronounce myself fully anymore. Then one Sunday morning, the silence broke. My phone buzzed beside the sink while I was rinsing a coffee cup. I didn't recognize the number. The message was short. "He's okay. Still doesn't blame you." There was no name, no follow-up, but I knew. I stood there, coffee dripping down my wrist, reading that message again and again. My brother had spoken, for the first time since being exiled. It didn't matter that he hadn't signed it. I felt it in my chest, where truth sits before it ever finds words. He was alive, and somehow still saw me as part of him. That afternoon, I drove across town to the county records office. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't even think I was looking for anything. But something in my gut kept circling a memory. Mom, sitting on the cabin porch, brushing my hair as the sun dropped behind the hills. "This will always be yours," she had whispered, tying my braid with a ribbon. That memory hadn't returned to me in years, but it came back sharp, like it had been waiting. I walked into the records office just before they closed. The woman behind the counter asked for the property ID. I handed her a slip of paper with the cabin address written in my handwriting. She typed for a while, squinting at the screen. "Do you have any documentation of ownership transfer?" she asked. "I'm not transferring. I'm looking to confirm what's already in place." More typing. Then a pause. She tilted her head slightly. The title was updated 3 years ago. Full ownership assigned to Varela Darlington. I blinked. What about my mother? She bought it. She left it to us. There's no record of that while being executed. No legal hold in your name or your brother's. I stared at the woman, not because I doubted her, because I suddenly realized I hadn't doubted her. Not for a second. I left without saying anything. I didn't ask for a printout. I didn't need one. Driving back, I didn't cry, but I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles throbbed. The cabin. The only place untouched by Varela's curated version of our family. The one thing Mom had promised us. And somehow, even that had been stolen. Not in a blaze, not with sirens or lawyers, but quietly, like everything else. That night, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor of the attic. It smelled like dust and cedar, the scent of forgotten things. I pulled out an old storage bin with faded labels and peeled tape. Inside were boxes of photos, a broken snow globe, Kael's third-grade science medal, and a stack of birthday cards I barely remembered. Near the bottom, tucked beneath a yellowing newspaper, was a card, unsigned, but clearly my mother's handwriting. "Don't ever let them take what's ours." It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't even complete, but I knew it was for me. That sentence didn't feel like advice. It felt like an instruction, a call to arms. I held the card in my hand long after the attic grew dark. Everything was connecting. They hadn't just pushed Kael out. They hadn't just silenced me in meetings or kept me from hospital rooms. They'd restructured the story of this family, bit by bit, until the truth couldn't breathe. My mother's name didn't exist in the cabin registry anymore. Kael's inheritance had been reclassified as inactive. My presence in anything, legal, emotional, familial, had been filed under unnecessary. This wasn't neglect. It was erasure, the deliberate, strategic kind. I climbed down from the attic and closed the hatch behind me. I didn't say anything to Dad that night. He was in his study, watching one of those silent documentaries he never finished. Varela was in the kitchen, humming along to music she didn't really like. I walked past them both like a shadow, like they'd trained me to. But I wasn't a shadow anymore. I wasn't going to be polite or patient or easy to ignore. I went to my room, placed the card on my nightstand, and sat at my desk. That night, I started drafting a list. A real one. Dates, transactions, inconsistencies, names. It wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. Not yet. Because it had a title. Things they took. At the top, I wrote one word. Mom. Under that, Kyle. Then, me. By the time I closed my laptop, the air felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but sharper. I turned off the light. I won't. I won't. That thought rang steady in my head the next morning as I walked downstairs. I passed by the living room, where Orwin sat in his usual chair with his newspaper open but unread. The morning light coming through the tall windows made everything seem softer than it was, like a thin veil over a bruise. I was halfway through a piece of toast when I heard my name from the hallway. The maid, new, young, polite to a fault, told me I was needed in the study. The last time someone said that, Kyle was still living in this house. I left my plate and followed her down the hallway. The door to the study was already open. Inside, Varela was seated, legs crossed, wearing a beige suit that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She smiled at me the way a cat watches a cornered bird. Beside her sat a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, tan suit, briefcase at his feet. Lawyer, clearly. "Good morning, sweetheart," Varela purred, gesturing to the chair across from her. "We just need a quick signature, nothing dramatic." I didn't sit. The lawyer opened a manila folder and slid a document across the table toward me. "This is a formal release," he explained, calm, almost bored, relinquishing any and all claims you may have to the Darlington Foundation and its associated properties. I blinked. "Why now?" "It's cleaner this way," Varela said, with a tone so gentle it scraped. "We're restructuring the foundation. Simpler legal lines. It's best for everyone." "Everyone meaning you?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. I picked up the pen, not to sign, but to hold it, test its weight. "I'll need to review this with my own legal counsel," I said quietly. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Not panic, not surprise. Something colder. Calculation. "You're welcome to," she replied smoothly. "But I'd advise you not to drag this out." I placed the pen back on the table and slid the document toward her. "Noted." As I turned to leave, she leaned in close enough for her breath to brush my shoulder. "I've buried bigger problems than you, Sophia," she whispered. "Don't dig into things you don't understand." I didn't flinch, didn't give her the satisfaction, but I could feel Orwin watching. He hadn't spoken once. He just sat there, staring at a spot on the wall, like the room wasn't full of landmines. Later that evening, after dinner had come and gone in forced civility, I sat alone in my room. The air smelled faintly of lavender detergent and the citrusy candle I'd lit to mask the scent of old dust. I turned on the local news, more for background noise than anything else. Then I heard her voice. Varela, on screen. A segment titled Women Who Lead was showcasing her charity work. She sat beside a local anchor, chin tilted in modest sorrow. "It hasn't been easy," she was saying, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. "Losing a son, especially to circumstances that hurt the family. But you protect what you can. You move forward." The anchor nodded solemnly. "You've shown such grace. The city sees that." I felt my fingernails dig into the cushion beside me. Grace? Protect. I muted the TV before I put something through it. I didn't storm downstairs. I didn't scream. I opened my laptop instead, drafted a brief formal email to the Darlington Foundation Board. Just a few questions about recent shifts in leadership, asset reallocation, and voting rights. Nothing accusatory, just enough to make them wonder if I knew more than I let on. I blind carbon-copied KL. The next morning, I printed the email, sealed it in an envelope, and left it on the entryway table. And then, before the sun went down, I walked into Varela's office while she was out meeting some local politician's wife for tea. I didn't touch anything, didn't snoop. I just left a note on her desk, next to her perfectly arranged fountain pens and schedule book. It was short. I'm not the girl you edited out of the picture. I'm the one who kept the negatives. I didn't slam the door when I left, but I didn't close it gently either. The note I left on her desk hadn't been there for more than 12 hours when the next move came. That morning, I was sipping coffee alone in the breakfast nook when Varela appeared, all honeyed smiles and a hint of amusement dancing in her eyes. "You and I should go out today," she said, casually stirring her tea. "The lake's beautiful this time of year. Thought we could take the boat out. Just us." I knew better than to think it was an olive branch. Nothing in this house was ever that simple. But I also knew I needed to see what she was willing to show, or hide. "Sure," I replied. "Sounds peaceful." An hour later, we were gliding across the glassy surface of the estate's private lake. The boat was small, meant more for leisure than sport, and the oars creaked softly with every pull. Trees rimmed the waterline, their reflections almost perfect. It was the kind of scene you'd see in a catalog for retirement homes. Varela sat across from me, her sunglasses shielding whatever expression she didn't want me to read. "You know," she began, voice light, "when I first came into this family, I thought Kyle was complicated. Always so intense, always trying to protect everyone from something." I said nothing. She continued, "But I realize now, some people wear trauma like a badge. They make everyone around them pay for things that happened years ago." Still, I didn't bite. That was her game. Provoke, then twist the reaction into ammunition. She leaned forward slightly. "I know you've been digging. Files, emails, foundation board, that note on my desk, very poetic." Her hand rested near the edge of the boat, just inches from mine. "I want to believe we can still make this civil, Sophia, that we can reset things." My phone was tucked in the side of my jacket, the voice memo app running silently. I didn't need a confession, I just needed tone. Context, anything she'd say when she thought no one else could hear. "Why don't you start?" I said. "Tell me what you want from me." She gave a soft laugh, too airy to be genuine. "I want you to stop pretending you have power in this house." Then, as if it were an accident, the boat rocked slightly. Her hand brushed mine, and in that instant, my phone slipped from my jacket pocket and splashed into the lake. "Oh no," she gasped, leaning over the side, though she made no effort to retrieve it. I looked at her. She smiled, only with her lips. We sat in silence for the rest of the ride. Back on land, I walked to the guest house and headed straight for the wall panel behind the bookshelf. It wasn't widely known that the estate had a second layer of surveillance. Older, grainier, but still functional. I'd found the manual years ago, when I was still young enough to be curious, but old enough to understand why secrets needed doors. I pulled up the feed from the lake dock, but the file for that time frame was corrupt, not missing, not deleted, just unreadable. Someone had tampered with it. I copied everything up to the corrupted minute onto an external drive and slid it into a book hollowed out to hide valuables. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, but I'd learned to archive everything now, just in case. 2 days later, I got a phone call from a blocked number. A man's voice on the other end, formal and unreadable. "Ms. Darlington, you've been named in a report regarding unauthorized access to confidential financial materials related to the Darlington Foundation. We'd like you to come down for a statement." I didn't flinch. "Of course," I replied. "Let me know when and where." The station was modest, tucked between a bakery and an old hardware store. I arrived on time, wearing a dark blue blouse and slacks that said, "I know exactly how serious I am." The detective who met me wasn't unkind, but his questions were guided more by assumption than inquiry. Can you explain why you accessed records dated prior to your removal from the board? He asked. I wasn't aware I'd been officially removed, I replied, keeping my tone even. I've received no legal notice of that change. There's a discrepancy between what's on paper and what's being enforced within the organization, he said. In other words, I said, someone decided I didn't belong and didn't bother making it official. He didn't respond. I answered everything with precision. I wasn't reckless. I hadn't hacked, stolen, or tampered. Everything I'd seen was either publicly available or obtained before I was frozen out. As I stood to leave, he looked at me a beat too long. You're not the first family member to push back, he said quietly, but they usually stop before it gets ugly. I'm not most family members, I said, and walked out. Back at the estate, I didn't bother going into the main house. I stayed in the guest house, made tea, and stared at the wall. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the treetops, I picked up my phone, the new one, and dialed the number I'd written down weeks ago. A private investigator in Boulder. Retired federal. Discreet. Thorough. He answered on the third ring. This is Decker. I didn't waste time. My name is Sophia Darlington. I need to find proof someone tried to erase the truth. A pause. Then, you came to the right place. By the time I hung up with Decker, the air outside my apartment had turned brittle, the kind of dry cold that made your breath visible even before sunrise. I closed the window, poured the rest of my lukewarm tea down the drain, and sat in front of my laptop. Again. The cursor blinked on an empty email draft I hadn't touched in hours. Then the voicemail came. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me press play anyway. The voice that came through was low, trembling, aged by regret more than time. I saw what she did. I stayed quiet too long. I'm sorry. Just that, a whisper from the past, one I hadn't expected. Mrs. Gretchen, I said out loud, as if saying her name might make her real again. She'd vanished not long after Kyle had been thrown out. No warning, no goodbye. At the time, I assumed she'd just moved on. But now I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. I emailed Decker and told him we had a live lead. By morning, he replied with a meeting spot and a time. Noon. Just outside Boulder. A quiet cafe tucked between an antique bookstore and a pharmacy that still sold milk in glass bottles. Gretchen was already seated when I arrived. Wrapped in a brown shawl, her silver hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly collapsed, she looked older than I remembered, but sharper too. Her eyes still caught details no one else did. She didn't waste time. She rehearsed it, Gretchen said after we ordered coffee. I was there. She stood in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom, tore the robe herself, adjusted it, looked at the angle, and said, "That'll do." Then she practiced the scream. Twice. I sat perfectly still, not out of fear, but out of fury held tight like a thread. She knew your father would come running. She made sure she was the only voice he'd hear. Gretchen opened her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. I kept notes. I didn't know who to give them to. I didn't think anyone would believe me. Inside were pages, handwritten, dated, observations, shifts in household staff, arguments between Orwin and Varela, timeline entries that aligned with foundation decisions, and, buried near the bottom, a line that chilled me. May 6th, 10:12 p.m. She rehearsed the scream. She paid off the IT guy too, Gretchen added. That's why the surveillance footage from that night vanished. I saw the receipt once. She said it was for private consulting. Will you give a statement? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded. Decker met us in the parking lot half an hour later. The statement was recorded. Signed. Stored in 2 encrypted drives and 1 secure cloud folder. It was the first brick I needed, and it was solid. Back in my apartment that evening, I sat down and opened a folder labeled Truth. Inside were documents I'd been collecting, email threads, copies of estate transfers, the lawyer's refusal to send me the original board minutes, and now, Gretchen's affidavit. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a weapon. I backed it all up, twice. Uploaded it to a secure cloud, burned it onto a disk, saved it to a USB hidden inside an old lipstick tube I never used. My phone buzzed. A message from Decker. "We're not done, but this cracks the wall." An hour later, I stepped outside to take out the trash. A plain white envelope was taped to my front door. No address, no stamp, just my name in block letters. Inside, one sentence, typed on an old printer, the edges faint. "If you push this, there will be consequences, for you, for him." No signature, no contact. But it didn't need one. I scanned it for fingerprints before touching anything else. Then I snapped a photo and emailed it to Kale with the subject line, "They're still scared of the truth." The reply came faster than I expected. "Let them be. We're not scared anymore." I didn't write back. Instead, I turned off all the lights in my apartment except for the one above my desk. I picked up a dry erase marker and stood before the whiteboard I'd mounted months ago, still mostly blank. In red ink, I wrote 5 words. She rehearsed the scream. Then I underlined it. Once. Twice. The red ink was barely dry on my whiteboard when the invitation arrived. Gold-foiled lettering embossed on stiff cream cardstock. The Darlington Foundation's annual Winter Gala. It was being hosted at the Ashcroft Museum downtown, a space usually reserved for charity galas and oil paintings of dead men. This year's event promised a catered dinner, a silent auction, and a speech from Varela herself in honor of her decade of service to the community. I wasn't on the guest list. That part didn't surprise me, but Decker had already anticipated this. 2 days earlier, he'd introduced me to Elise, his niece, a junior donor coordinator for one of the event's sponsors. A well-placed name here, a borrowed assistant badge there, and I had an entry pass clipped to my blazer. "Black suits you," Elise whispered just before we entered the hall. "It's not for mourning," I replied. "It's for presents." The museum lobby buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses. Glittering gowns floated past me like shadows from another world. I kept my movements calm, purposeful. Too slow, and you draw suspicion. Too fast, and you look like you're hiding something. I spotted Decker near the back wall. He gave me a subtle nod. He'd been working with a freelance AV technician for weeks, ensuring the system could handle a timed injection of media content, just long enough to show what needed to be shown. The text cue was simple. 3 minutes after Varela began her speech. No delays, no room for technical apologies. I had the backup on a flash drive in my purse. Another copy waited with Decker. 2 more lived online, secured and time-locked to release in 24 hours. I checked my phone one last time. No new messages, no surprises. Inside the main exhibit room, people were beginning to settle into their assigned tables. I stood by the wall, just behind the final row of seats, next to the tall faux marble columns that flanked the stage. Then, right on schedule, Varela stepped into the spotlight. She wore silver, tasteful, understated. It shimmered under the chandeliers, just enough to remind everyone that she knew how to shine. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice smooth with just the right touch of humility. "Thank you for joining us as we celebrate another year of growth, outreach, and family." Family. I clenched my hands behind my back. She spoke about legacy, about shaping lives, about resilience in the face of hardship. Every word a carefully polished lie. Then came the cue, 3 minutes. Her hand lifted to cue the staff for her photo slideshow, but instead, the lights dimmed, not entirely, just enough to hush the room. And then the screen came alive. It wasn't a foundation slideshow. It wasn't a donor thank you reel. It was a bedroom. Hers. The grainy security footage wasn't pretty. It wasn't filtered or lit with perfection. But it was real. Varela stood before her mirror, robe already torn slightly at the shoulder. She adjusted it, tilted her head, looked into the glass and said, "No, too dramatic." Then she tried again. And again. On the 3rd take, she screamed. Blood-curdling, calculated. After the silence that followed, she straightened her hair and whispered, "That'll do." Gasps filled the hall. One woman clutched her pearls like she'd been physically struck. Orwin, seated near the front, didn't move. His hands dropped into his lap and his shoulders slumped like someone had just removed the final piece holding him upright. The screen went black. For a second, the silence screamed louder than anything she had rehearsed. Then Varela herself let out a sound, raw, broken, nothing like the one from the video. Her carefully constructed mask shattered in front of 100 witnesses. People turned in their seats. A few stood. Others began whispering, pulling out phones, taking photos, recording reactions. I stood still, arms at my sides, breathing evenly. I didn't smile. I didn't move toward the stage. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. Let them see. Let them know. Let them remember that silence doesn't mean consent, and that truth doesn't stay buried forever. I turned toward the exit, my heels echoing softly on the marble floor. As I passed the final row of chairs, I whispered to no one in particular, but loud enough for her to hear. Rehearsals are over. And the crowd parted like curtains on a stage no longer hers. By sunrise the next morning, every local news station had the same headline on screen. Darlington matriarch exposed in decade-long lie. Some of them went further. Scandal at the gala. The scream that was staged. Lies in lace and lipstick. I watched it all from my small kitchen table, spooning cold cereal into my mouth. No appetite, but not anxious either. Just still. I hadn't felt that in a while. The footage had gone viral overnight. It spread like something people didn't know they'd been starving for. A lie, cracked wide open. I didn't call Kyle. I didn't text Decker. There was nothing left to say. Later that afternoon, the board of the Darlington Foundation released a statement. Orwin had stepped down effective immediately. They called it an opportunity for new leadership to carry the mission forward. But anyone who'd seen that video knew exactly what that meant. That evening, just as the light began to dip behind the ridge, I heard a knock at the door. I already knew who it was. He stood there without his usual suit jacket, no tie. His shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen before. His voice when he spoke was hoarse. I didn't know where else to go. I let him in. He didn't ask if I had time to talk. He just walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch, the way guests do when they know they're not really welcome. I watched it, he said quietly. All of it. I sat across from him, arms folded. Then I don't need to explain it. No, he shook his head. You don't. For a while, we sat in silence. I failed him, he whispered. I failed you. I didn't flinch. You chose her version of the truth over the son you raised. His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. I saw the robe, he said, the torn shoulder, the tears, and I reacted. I didn't ask. I didn't listen. I didn't think you were capable of lying, Sophia. But her? She had a way of making anything feel believable. I wanted to scream, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. You didn't trust me either. I'm not here to ask you for anything, he added, just to say I'm sorry. I stood. It's too late for that. He nodded once, eyes glassy, and then he left. No hug, no dramatic goodbye. Just the click of the door behind him, quieter than any apology he could have spoken. By the end of the week, Varela had vanished from public view. Her social media profiles disappeared. The foundation scrubbed her from every campaign and press release. Sponsors dropped out. Her face became a symbol of manipulation, of vanity, of all the things that wear philanthropy like perfume. And the internet did what it does best. People started digging. They found offshore accounts, falsified tax reports, anonymous blogs detailing how she'd silenced others before KL. A woman from her hometown claimed she'd faked a medical diagnosis in college for sympathy votes. The deeper it got, the worse it smelled. I received an email from a civil attorney not long after. He offered to represent me in a defamation lawsuit, said I could own the Darlington estate by summer. I declined. She's already lost the only thing she ever valued, credibility, I told him. Instead, I uploaded everything, the files, the statements, the recordings. I sent them to a nonprofit that defends people falsely accused of crimes they didn't commit. I told them they could use my name. I wasn't hiding anymore. One day, I found myself driving past the Darlington estate. The hedges were overgrown. The gates still stood, but they hadn't been polished in weeks. Paint peeled at the edges of the gatehouse. It looked abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. Someone was still in there, pretending the past hadn't happened. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. The house is still there, but I don't live in its shadow anymore. The house faded into my rearview mirror like the last page of a book I didn't want to reread. I drove until the road narrowed and the town signs changed, the landscape growing quieter, softer. Outside Boulder, where the land breathed deeper and the sky felt wider, Kyle and I had found a parcel of land, untouched, uncomplicated. We bought it in cash. No lawyers, no strings, no family names on contracts, just us. A year had passed since the gala. In that time, the storm had blown through headlines, and headlines had moved on, as they always do. But our life had not been built for the front page. We built for quiet. The house was modest. One level, wraparound porch, windows that let in the sunrise, and didn't try to block the sunset. Cale had taken to woodworking, his hands finding calm in shaping things instead of surviving them. I planted herbs, tomatoes, a stubborn lemon tree that refused to thrive but never died. The silence here was different, not the silence of fear, or being ignored, or made invisible. This was the silence of choosing when to speak. One afternoon, I was sorting through old mail when I found it. The envelope had no return address. The postmark was months old. Inside was a letter, handwritten in the uneven script I'd memorized as a child. It was from Orwin. "I'm sorry," it began. Not just for what I believed, but for what I refused to even question. He wrote about Kael, about the kind of man he'd been, the boy who built model rockets, who asked questions no one could answer. The son he failed not once, but over and over, by not standing between him and the lie. I didn't protect either of you, and I can't undo that. I can only tell you the truth now, if it matters. There was no defense in his words, no excuse, but there was something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he finally understood he'd thrown away. I didn't cry when I read it. I didn't call him either. I folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it in the box beneath my bed. I kept it, not as closure, but as reminder. Closure suggests something ends, but some wounds don't close. They just learn how to breathe without bleeding. Weeks later, I stood at the front of our small town library. They'd asked me to speak, not about the scandal, not about my family name, but about justice. I shared what I had learned, not as a victim, but as someone who had lived long enough in the shadow of lies to know the value of truth spoken out loud. Afterward, a woman approached me. Her eyes were tired, but her hands were steady. "My daughter went through something like you," she said, but she never got her voice back. "Thank you for using yours." I nodded, unsure how to accept a thank you for simply surviving. Later that night, I sat on the porch, barefoot, mug in hand. Kael joined me, handed me a folded paper with a smile. "What's this?" "A deed," he said. "For the cabin." I reclaimed the title. I stared at him. "You didn't have to." "I did," he cut in. "Because it was never hers to begin with, and because Mom said it was ours." We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. Behind us, the house hummed quietly. It wasn't revenge that brought peace. It was clarity. A return, not to the life we lost, but to the truth we always knew. I didn't win because I destroyed her. I won because I refused to become her. Sometimes, the ones who stay silent the longest are the ones carrying the heaviest truth. This story isn't just about a lie, it's about what happens when a family chooses comfort over justice, and how one person's courage can change everything. Have you ever been pushed aside in your own family's story? Let us know in the comments. We read every word. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe for more real, emotional family stories that uncover the truths no one wants to talk about.